So good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Bonnell. I'm the co-lead for the update of the hazard mitigation plan for the territory. My colleague and the lead of this effort, Kim Waddell, is having some technical difficulty at the moment, but I hope that he will be joining us very soon. So today we're really excited to have you all for this I think very exciting webinar, which is the fourth in our webinar series on engineering and engineering for resilience. The topic today is really rethinking resilience in the Virgin Islands. So for those who are not familiar with the HMP and what we're doing, this is a grant that we received from Vitima and from FEMA, working together with Vitima, the territorial agency, to update the plan. This diagram here shows our process and the outcome being the creation of the hazard mitigation plan. And we have a sample of all the different groups who we are working with. And the key difference between our effort and previous effort is the use of this word resilience. It's really the lens of our planning process. It's really what we are using to think about what we're working on. And it's also a bit of a nut that took us a while to crack. And today we will be having one of those nutcrackers, Dave Alderson and Dan Eisenberg, who really helped us figuring out how to do it. So why resilience and how does it come into what we're doing? It's because we're taking a systems approach, but also a comprehensive approach to how we think about hazard. Usually, for hazard mitigation plan, we look at what are the stressors or the hazards and how they impact critical infrastructure. Here, we're looking at how they impact critical infrastructure, how they impact essential services, and how different hazards can prevent us here in the Virgin Islands from really living the life that we want. And so ultimately, this concept of resilience comes in because it's about how do we get what we need in order to function. So why is that important? It's important because after the hurricane, and those are some of pictures, and I'm sure you've seen those and others similar. After the hurricane, everything in the territory failed. The road network, the electrical network, the wastewater system, everything, any type of system that you can think about has failed. And so as we embark in a rebuilding, we realized that, we suffered more than $7.5 billion in losses. Every single system has failed. Every single system needs to be rebuilt. And so how do we rebuild? And as we rebuild, what do we do with this word called resilience? So what are resilient systems? What does that mean to build in a resilient way? And that's the question that we have been tackling and wondering about for the past 2 years. So if you think about resilience, the way that usually it's been talked about is this idea of bouncing back. You are here, you suffer a disaster, the resilient system bounces back really quickly. You don't spend money, you don't spend too much time to get back to wherever you were. A less resilient system, it would take longer to sort of bounce back, or sometimes you don't bounce back at all. So those are resilient system, less resilient system. So let's look at what that means for the VI. Here is a graph of change in employment after different disasters. So we have Hurricane Hugo here in orange, we have Hurricane Marilyn in light blue, Hurricane Irma Maria in black here. So what we see is that after Hugo, after any type of event, and this is Puerto Rico after Maria in dash line. This year is when the hurricane happened. Well, everybody, every single time, employment in the VI went down, similar to what we see here, right? Something goes down, and then something goes back up. But what we see is that, okay, so after Hugo, we bounced back after, let's say, 12 months, a year. After Marilyn, we didn't bounce back, we didn't decrease that much, but it took maybe the same amount of time, a year or so, to quote unquote bounce back. After Irma Maria, we suffered way more employment loss, and we took more than a year, close to 2 years, to bounce back. So what does that mean? That means that I thought we were resilient after Hugo. But yet, Marilyn, we still suffered a loss. And Irma Maria, we suffer a bigger loss. So were we resilient here? Were we resilient here? Or maybe now we are resilient? Maybe not, because we are suffered another, disaster named as COVID that also, in fact, impacted our employment. So is it really the way to look at resilience, this idea of bouncing back? And if we bounce back after Hugo, why did we suffer additional losses after Marilyn? What is it that we didn't do or should have done after Hugo to avoid the loss of employment? Or do we always suffer losses of employment, and this idea of time and money and effort maybe is a misguided way of looking at things? So that's the type of question that we started to ask ourselves after we started to work on this issue of resilience. So going back to this diagram of bouncing back and looking at this concept of bouncing back, what we realized is that, well, yes, you bounce back from 1 to 3 or to 2, but 2 and 3 are not 1. You don't really go back to anything that you had before. So people start to use the word bounce forward. Are you bouncing forward? Is 3 really better than 2, really better than 1? I don't know, because we still suffered losses after Marilyn, and we suffered even more losses after Irma Marilyn. In any case, 1 is different than 3, different than 2. And is this concept, is this goal of building back, this concept of getting back to something really the right way of looking at resilience? We don't know, and I think that maybe not. But what we know is that looking at just preventing impact of hazard on the built environment might not make us more resilient. And we know that looking at how we're doing now, what's going on right now, how we are operating under blue sky condition and the non-disaster condition really impact and really affect where we're going to be in the future. And the last thing we know is that the way we operate, the way we work, the way we manage our system really has an impact, regardless of how many, generators we have or how strong our roof is. The way we operate things really has an impact on how we survive and how we, quote unquote, bounce back. So those are just examples of what I just said. After the hurricane, we started to invest in new poles, or we're starting to strengthen some of our infrastructure, building new roads. So it means that if there's another disaster, another interruption, we should be okay, right? We will not see this sort of dip before. And yet, look at the news in the past 2 years. There was a composite pole that was toppled during Dorian, not by wind, by something else. So does that mean that our electrical system is more resilient? Another, Vaya. Vaya is our telecommunication company. So Vaya restores services after fiber cut. That has nothing to do with the hurricane. And yet we lost communication, we lost internet for nearly a day. Is our telecommunication system more resilient? We spent a lot of time after the hurricane investing into resilient system. Delta variant concern prompts the governor to delay return of in-person learning at public schools. But we just invested in schools. We invested millions of dollars in building new schools. So is our education system not resilient? What does resilient mean? Does it really have anything to do with what we call robustness, which is building stronger, which is what we do after disaster? Or is resilience something different that we have to do regardless of robustness to make sure that what we need, the service that we need, is being delivered so that we can function as a society? With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Dan Eisenberg and David Alderson, who are both at the Naval Postgraduate School. Just going to read their bio real quick. Dr. Alderson is a professor in the Operation Research Department at and he serves as the founding director for the Center of Infrastructure Defense at the Naval Postgraduate School. And I believe I'm going to put the link of the postgraduate school in the chat after I've read their bio. Dr. Alderson joined the Operation Research Department at NPS in 2006 after serving in various positions, doing exciting work in California at the different research center and the Santa Fe Institute. His teaching focuses on computational method for operation research. His research focuses on the function and operation of critical infrastructure system, with particular emphasis on how to invest limited resources to ensure efficient and resilient performance in the face of accidents. He received his PhD from Stanford University and his undergrad in Princeton. The second honored guest today is Dr. Eisenberg. He's a research assistant professor of operation research at the Naval Postgraduate School and the deputy director at the Center for Infrastructure Defense. And again, I will put the link in the chat after I've finished the introduction. Dr. Eisenberg served as researcher for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. His research focused before joining the Naval Postgraduate School. His research focused on the design, operation, and adaptation of resilient infrastructure systems, with emphasis on applying resilience engineering theory to improve system design and emergency operation. He receives his PhD and master's in civil, environmental, and sustainable energy, engineering from Arizona State University. I don't know where you got your, also your bachelor. So he received his bachelor from the University of California, Davis. So with that being said, I will let our honored guests, Dr. Alderson and Eisenberg, go ahead and make their presentation.
Okay, thank you, Greg, and thank you, Kim, for inviting us here. Good afternoon, everyone. It's our privilege and pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much for spending some time with us during your lunch hour. I'm sorry very much that we're not there in person. We were last down there in February of 2020, right before the world broke, and we're very eager to get back. So we're hoping that maybe this fall we'll be able to have some of these conversations in person. But in the meantime, web technology works pretty well. And so today what Dan and I are going to do is to talk a little bit about how we think of resilience and how that's different from a lot of what you've seen. So Greg, the introduction that you've provided is perfect in the sense that we're going to talk exactly about this notion of rebound and robustness. And we're going to do it in the context of work that we're doing, and we know that you're all doing in the Virgin Islands. We've been, just by way of background, we've been supported by FEMA to work down in the territory since early 2018, specifically looking at interdependent lifeline infrastructure systems, as well as supporting Greg and Kim and their team in the development of the Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan. So with that, let me share my screen. We are going to have slides today. Dan and I are professors. We can't help ourselves. So, okay, and let me just get this set up over here. Okay, and if there are questions as we go, don't hesitate to interrupt us and ask. Also, we'll be trying to monitor the chat. In the event that there are questions in the chat, we'll try to be responsive to this as well. At the Naval Postgraduate School, we've been teaching online since March of 2020, so we're pretty familiar with this Zoom technology. Okay, so we are from the Naval Postgraduate School. I've provided a picture of it. That's what it looks like here in Monterey, and we're way out here in California, right? So we're 3 time zones away. And Dan and I run a research center on our campus called the Center for Infrastructure Defense. In particular, so our students are mid-career military officers from the Navy, as well as all branches of service, as well as international officers. And they come to NPS primarily to get a master's degree in some technical field. Our field is operations research. So that is quantitative decision-making, data science, optimization, statistics, all of the data science kinds of things that you hear about now. And we use those skills to think about, Dana and I in particular, critical infrastructure systems. So what you see here on the right side of this figure are 3 images of St. Croix, and they're models respectively of the electric power grid, the potable water distribution network, and then the road system respectively, and that reflects some of the work that we've been doing. I think Greg was going to put the link to the, perfect. And in fact, there is a link in the chat if you want to go to our center's website, and if you go under projects for USVI, you'll see some of the work that we've been doing there. So today we're not going to talk about the specific modeling efforts that we've been doing on these infrastructure systems. Perhaps those will be a topic of a future webinar when we're talking about electric power or water or transportation, supply chain kinds of things. But today the idea is to talk about resilience, and in particular try to orient or perhaps reorient you in terms of how we think about it. So what's the start of the story, the agenda, right? So this is what was posted in the flyer, right? We've all suffered too much. It seems like things are failing all the time by extreme weather, accidents, as well as just failures in engineering. And now everybody's talking about making our infrastructures and communities more resilient. But what does this mean? And also, how do we get there? And why aren't we there already? Right. So, you know, it seems that not a week goes by when there's something in the news globally about extreme weather events that are causing all kinds of heartache. This week, it was extreme flooding in Tennessee and North Carolina. We've had buildings collapse in Florida. Of course, we have the Delta variant that's causing disruptions to global travel and economics and other kinds of things. So how do we make sense of all this? So the starting point of this story is that, well, we inhabit a world of complex interactions, right? And your world can be as big or small as you might look here. We're going to try to focus on the Virgin Islands today. And in particular, this world is populated by a number of different things. We have a number of human systems. We have economic systems. We have cultural systems. We have family systems. We have work organizational systems. And those human systems live within an environment. So we have a number of environmental ecological systems. We have coral reefs. We have mangroves. We have different watersheds. So we have, we occupy this natural environment. And then in that, we've built a number of technological systems. We've made buildings and roads, and we string power lines, and we have pipes for water. And all of these systems are interconnected in some way. And so a really important starting point is to recognize that these are all systems, and these systems are constantly evolving. They're not static in any way. They are constantly evolving, and they're driven by incentives, and they're shaped by constraints, right? So you can think of economic incentives for people to invest in certain types of buildings or property or various kinds of venture, and constraints that are maybe regulations, environmental regulations or other kinds of things. So we live in a world that is constantly evolving, and much of the conversation that we've been having with Greg and Kim and other colleagues is that we really do think of the Virgin Islands in its totality as a living system, where all of these systems are undergoing constant change. Now, what's the challenge for this world that we live in? Well, this world has growing complexity, right? We have more interconnections among these things. We have new technologies that are being deployed. There's increased pressure to do more with less. So for those working in government or in industry, or actually really in education or anything else, there's pressure to do more with less. And we're doing all this in the context of a changing environment. That is, we increasingly recognize that the future is not going to be like the past, and that we're going to see things that we're going to encounter things that we've never seen before. So this means that there are new threats and new vulnerabilities, and the question becomes, what do we do about it? Well, traditional approaches to thinking about threats and vulnerabilities use concepts such as reliability and risk. Reliability is a discipline of engineering that's all about how do you take unreliable things and you connect them together in a way such that the system as a whole works in a reliable way. It's kind of amazing. Risk is something that is used in many different fields, and historically has been based on estimates of event likelihoods and consequences. The image here on the right comes from a program at the MITRE Corporation. MITRE is a large contractor, and what they're showing you here is what's known as a risk matrix. And so the idea is that you're going to look at potential events, you're going to look at how likely these events are, and you're going to rate them kind of from low to high, and you're going to look at the consequences of events. Consequences could be damage or economic loss or lives lost or other kinds of things. And you're also going to rate those impacts, those consequences. And the idea of risk is that you want to focus on some combination of high likelihood and high consequence events. And that's the intention is to provide a means of prioritizing the things that need to be attended to, because you can't typically address everything. Now, this notion of risk analysis has been codified in a number of different processes. The Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency has its own risk management process that it talks about. And sort of to kind of simplify the idea is that we go through some process where we identify scenarios or events or threats that are of concern. We assess them in terms of their likelihoods and their impacts. We evaluate these risks, and then we make some decisions about how we want to prioritize our efforts. One of the things that's important to recognize about these kind of risk techniques is that they tend to rely primarily on past events. Our assessment of likelihoods most often is related to what we've seen in the past. And again, as we've just seen this week, this is a quote from the Washington Post talking about floods in Tennessee, right? I'll read the quote. "We should be very aware that climate change is here, and we need to take some action to get ready for things that haven't happened before." And so one of the drawbacks of this traditional risk approach is essentially that we cannot identify in advance all the bad things that can happen. We are going to be surprised in some way. And much of the work that Dan and I are involved with is thinking about this notion of surprise, which is more than just anecdotal. Surprise has been studied in a technical way for a long period of time, and much of our work is about surprise in the presence of climate change as it pertains to infrastructure. Okay, so reliability and risk are perhaps not enough, right? You perhaps already recognize this coming to a talk on resilience. So then what about this thing, resilience? What is it and how do we make sense of it? So here I'm going to show a picture, right? Greg already showed a cartoon sort of version of this. This is the picture that is prevalent within the national academies, within NIST, within FEMA, within a number of federal as well as industrial programs. And the definition of resilience that I'll read here is common across many of them. It's the ability to prepare for anticipated hazards, adapt to changing conditions, withstand or absorb and recover rapidly from those disruptions. And the cartoon is a picture that looks like this, where you've got some notion of goodness. It could be critical function. Is your electric power system working? Is your water system working? Is the supply chain working? These kinds of things. And the story is that things are going along just fine, and then there's an event, and so the performance of the system drops down, and then hopefully it recovers in some way. And that's the story that Greg told you. And in terms of a common measure of resilience, folks often look at, well, you know, if we think of this as kind of like almost like a bathtub, like how big is this bathtub, right? How much does it hold? The deeper it is, well, the worse it is. And the longer the disruption lasts, the worse it is. And so we'd like this to be as small as possible. And so many folks have adopted this as the notion of resilience. Now, this notion of resilience follows very closely sort of the stages of emergency management, right? We plan and prepare for things in advance of adverse events. We try to absorb them when they happen, and then we respond and we recover and we ultimately adapt. And so this picture, which is sometimes called the critical functionality curve, or this sort of resilience curve, we find to be quite limiting. And it's limiting in the sense that typically these kinds of pictures can only be drawn in retrospect, right? So it's like after the fact, we see how bad it was and how quickly recovered. What this picture doesn't tell you anything about was what was actually going on as we planned and prepared. What was going on as this failure happened or as this event happened? How hard were we working? Who was doing what? And in particular, as we move on from one event to the next, what could we have been doing better? This picture does not inform the actions that are ultimately necessary for think about practicing resilience. And so ultimately, we find this view of resilience limiting. We think about resilience differently, and we think that you should too. And so the goal for the remainder of this presentation is to sort of talk about this different view of resilience, these different elements, and how they're potentially applicable here in the Virgin Islands. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my share briefly to see if there are any questions. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to let Dan sort of share his screen and take over, and we'll proceed. But kind of as we do that, are there any questions at this point as we're going? Questions are not required, but it's certainly fun.
And if you have any question, you can put them in the chat, or you
yes,
can
and you can also put
yourself.
them in the chat. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, or you can unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask the question.
I think everyone's eager to hear the new way to think about resilience, or rethink, I guess. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Ooh, we got a question. How is this resilience definition different from the normal way people respond to disasters? You want to take that, Dave?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, so I think the next few slides are going to try to get at that specifically. And I think part of the answer is that resilience has to be more than emergency management, right? So that is to say, if we train our emergency managers to be the best that they possibly can be, doesn't mean that our infrastructure systems are going to be resilient, right? We have to focus on the operation of these systems to begin with, and that has to be a part of the story as well. So to some extent, I mean, you know, one view, and maybe it's overly sharp, would be to say, to some extent, if we're having to do emergency management, maybe we're not as resilient as we could be to begin with, right? But I think that's a great question. And if we don't address it in the next bit, please ask the question again at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, my immediate response is the definition that you just saw on your screen. I can put it back up. It's coming from Presidential Policy Declaration 21, which is from 2013. It has been adopted in all federal policies since then. And I wouldn't say it is any different than what people are normally doing for disaster response, and that's the problem. So what Dave is suggesting is, yes, we want to give you different definitions to think about, and that's what we're about to do. the way that it's currently talked about, either in your job, in policies that you might be looking at, or in directives sent from the top of the executive branch, might just kind of be rehashing things that we're already doing. And we should be changing the way that we do things. And we're going to use language that Greg introduced earlier and makes me so excited that he's using. And this is language. So I want to give you a little background. My dissertation for my PhD was called How to Think About Resilient Infrastructure Systems. That was the title of my dissertation. I care very much about how you think about these things. So the words and the language and the concepts are the things I really want to impart upon you. And so these terms, robustness and rebound, these are like terms of art that we use in both research and practice. And so as we move forward in trying to think about resilience in different ways, we should be utilizing this language, because this language helps organize the ways that we might be able to change things and make things better. So I believe these slides are going to be shared. This is being recorded right now. Please, hopefully you find this presentation and this organization helpful, and we hope that it helps move the ball forward in terms of what we could be doing besides maybe just regular emergency management best practices. That being said, I think a good way to try and organize more practical and effective ways of doing resilience and thinking about resilience still follows this kind of pre-event, post-event structure that you find in that critical functionality curve, that bathtub curve that both Dave and Greg have been showing. And so two concepts that we tend to talk about, and these are the outcomes that we want to see systems have, not necessarily the area under the curve, just we want our systems to be robust and we want our systems to bounce back, right? So we like to say, if we're really, really good about resilience in some cases, we have robust systems. We want robustness, and that's our system continues to function as intended. The hurricane comes, it blows over the island, it goes away, and nothing really changes. The power grid is still standing, the water system never turned off, there was no loss of internet, our roads aren't flooded, we can drive to work the next day. Rebound is slightly different. It's like, well, we are experiencing some kind of disruption, but we can get back really, really fast, right? So maybe some power poles get ripped out of the ground, we can replace them very quickly. Maybe the road does flood, but it drains and we're able to replace anything that broke very quickly. Maybe we lose the internet, but it's for a very short period of time. And we're able to fix those problems very quickly. And so these are the two most commonly discussed outcomes and goals for resilience that we find in the literature and in practice. And sometimes you actually find these words specifically in the definitions you have in federal policy or otherwise territorial policy. And we have examples for how we can actually make this happen. So rather than look at those bathtub curves, let's look at what people are actually doing, right? So to make robustness, one thing that we're doing in the territory is we're replacing those power poles that are made of wood, get ripped out in about a category 1, category 2 hurricane, and putting in a composite power pole that's rated for like category 6 off the chart type hurricanes. So this picture, I believe, is from St. John, and it's the actual composite power poles going down the road. And we're installing those composite power poles to make it so we have a more robust power grid. If you looked at images of after Hurricane Dorian, some composite power poles were still standing even after the hurricane blew over, which wooden power poles wouldn't necessarily be able to stand. These are robust, they survive big events. And then we have rebound types of practices, which might be these deployable line crews. So we have our trucks and we have a bunch of cabling and we have maybe backup poles and transformers sitting on the ground waiting. So when hurricanes blow over, when we have big disasters, we can very quickly replace the infrastructure that gets ripped out of the ground or the things that get broken. And if we were to replace those quickly, it could be like the disruption in service is almost non-existent, especially if it's immediately after the disaster and done with enough effort, operations, and equipment. And these are the ways that, in general, when we're talking about what people are doing to like plan and prepare and absorb and recover, like these are the actual things that people can do. These are the things that we think about. We have options for making our system robust that can absorb damages, can just withstand what's going on. We can put those systems in, and then we can have systems and equipment in place that help us rebound. We can recover from them. And so these two concepts do help make systems more resilient. The thing is, these don't really help with surprise necessarily all the time anyway. So even if we have the most robust system or the system that we think is going to handle all of these future events or even past events that we couldn't necessarily handle, or we have all the backup equipment in the world and all the capacity for rebounding our system very, very quickly, we're still going to be surprised. And so the example that I like to use is back in 2019, almost exactly 2 years to the day today, Hurricane Dorian went over St. John and caused a blackout because a composite power pole was hit by a tree, and a tree strike knocked over the pole. So these poles are rated for high wind. They're not necessarily rated for really, really strong debris strikes. And so a major tree hitting the pole led to a blackout with something that we thought was hardened for much more than a Category 1, Category 2 hurricane, which what Dorian was, right? So these things, these poles are supposed to survive Category 5 storms. This one failed in a Category 1 storm. That is a surprise from a robustness or rebound perspective. And so even the most robust systems that we have fail sometimes. Even the most quickly reach or be able to rebound effectively. And so we need other concepts, other things that we could be doing. So here's an example of something else that we could be doing. We could be having some kind of emergency generator. And what this is doing is kind of different. It's not saying our power system is going to act exactly how it is and the hurricane's going to blow over and nothing happens. It's saying we're going to have our power grid act differently when there's a disaster. We're going to start using different generation that is very rarely used, but really helpful in emergency situations. This also doesn't necessarily help you rebound faster. It helps you kind of survive the storm and still have electricity. And so we like to say that this extends your capability. We call it extensibility. Rather than utilizing the system as it is every day, we now add new capacity or adapt and try to add new capacity that we otherwise don't normally want to use on every good day, but could be used for these kind of disaster situations. Now, this provides resilience in a new way. It's not necessarily robustness, not necessarily rebound. Does this potentially have problems as well? The answer is yeah. I mean, your backup generators aren't necessarily going to work all the time as well. You know, if you don't have fuel for your backup generator, it's not going to operate. You know, if you don't know how to use it, it's not going to work as intended. If it hasn't been maintained, it might not turn on, even if it has everything that you anticipated. And we see this all the time, especially in the military. We have backup diesel generators for a lot of our buildings. And when the likelihood that a generator isn't going to kick on is 1 in 100, and you have 100 backup generators, you know one of those buildings isn't going to have electricity even after the storm. So the key idea here is, even with these other kinds of concepts, resilience is not about what you have. It's about what you do. It's not about the composite power pole. It's about the practices and policies you have in place to start putting those composite power poles in and changing them if you need to. It's not about having the line crews and the trucks and the extra cabling. It's about being able to deploy them, get them where they need to be, and install them. It's not about having a backup generator. It's about it kicking on when you need it. And so we very strongly recommend we start moving away from the way that resilience is normally talked about and even measured as, you know, some area under this curve, right? The difference in your employment rate, or the difference in your ability to serve electricity given a disruption, or the difference in your access to water. That's not resilience. That's like a noun. That's like a quantity that we're trying to measure. Resilience is all the things that people are doing around our infrastructure to make it so we can plan and prepare, absorb all those kinds of normal emergency management actions that we're trying to do. It's like, what are the actions? What are the options we actually have? So resilience is a verb. It's not a noun. In fact, if you look at the history of the word resilience, how it entered the English language, it actually was a verb first. It's called resile. If you want to go look it up, it's wonderful. And so I recommend using the word resile if you can, because it really forces your mind to start moving away from this kind of noun quantity-based view of resilience and more to this verb, I resiled, I responded, I acted. And there's a specific thing that we like to emphasize, is that there's other ways that we could be using the word resilience. One of them is resiliency. We hear this all the time, like, what is the resiliency of your system? This is as close to like a property, noun, what you have, not what you do view of the world that we don't necessarily like. So we like to say, let's move away from using this word entirely. So to try and change the way that we think about resilience, we want to move from resilience as a noun, like it's the backup generator, it is the composite pole, to the verb, it's being able to turn it on, it's actually being able to put it in. We don't want to be saying resiliency, because resiliency is like saying the backup generator is the solution. And so moving towards resilience, moving towards resile is like a new way that we like to think about it. And it's helped us really reformulate, reconsider the types of actions and recommendations we would want to make the territory more resilient. And
Dan,
so,
before we move on,
yeah.
can you go back there just for a moment? I want to emphasize one thing, right? You may be reacting to saying like nouns versus verbs. Who really cares about that? That's not going to help me, in any way. What we're trying to do is to change the way that you think about this, and in particular, we live in a world where a lot of the processes that we use for thinking about making our infrastructures more resilient are very object-based. They're very noun-based. You can buy things. You can spend money to buy poles. You can spend money to buy generators. Are we resilient? Did you buy those things? Acquiring the things is not necessarily going to make us more resilient, right? It's about the actions that go with that. And so as much as anything, what we want to do is we want to reorient your thinking about the doing, not the having. And that's not always easy, again, because the processes that we have in place, the things that are measured, it's easy to count things. It's easy to count generators. It's harder to measure process, but that's where we think that we ultimately need to go. Okay.
Yeah.
Mario has a question. He's got a hand.
Yes, I had to turn my mic on. Good afternoon, everyone. My question then in terms of this is, so we get funding, say, that's for resiliency. And to me, that funding comes with the idea that you must be resilient at the end of that process. And so the question is, what you're saying is, we need to prepare for things not necessarily being 100% perfect, that we have to expect failures, changes, what have you. That's what you're saying, right? Not that once we get this funding and we buy all the things, that things are going to be perfect. So when the next disaster comes, we shouldn't expect any impact.
Mario, that's a great question, and that's exactly right. So so something that I believe is true, right, is that no matter how well you prepare, you will be surprised. You will be surprised that something didn't work the way you thought it was. That you will be surprised that you see something that you never considered possible before. You will be surprised. And a key element of resilience is being poised to adapt. That's another phrase that we like to do, right? So you're ready to act in a way that you haven't acted before, right? So the idea that you can make an investment such that you are perfectly protected and nothing bad will happen, that's really much more of a robustness kind of an argument. Resilience is something different. Resilience is something more. Resilience is about how you operate when you're out of the playbook, right? When you have to improvise, and that's a key word that you're going to see coming up in the next few slides. It's a good question. Is there a follow-up?
No, I'll get another one later. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you.
Love it. Yeah, it's not about what you have. It's about what you do. It's very easy to count generators. It's very difficult to understand processes to make sure that they work and kick on when you need them to. And strongly agree, there is no way to have perfect information about the future. We are going to be surprised. There is no such thing as a perfectly robust system. And if you think that you have a perfectly robust system, you're going to be surprised even more when you realize that it's not what you thought it was. And so we want to add 2 new terms to the way that we like to think about resilience to try and add more capacity for adaptation. And so first of these is related to that backup generator, resilient systems extend. So one thing that we see resilient systems do is they stretch their function to support new needs in ways that potentially we never even planned for or were unanticipated prior. Another thing we see resilient systems do is they adapt or sustainably adapt. And so it changes to function in new ways. And so another example of that might be moving towards, let's say, a renewable energy distributed power grid rather than having our centralized system that's all being generated by diesel or natural gas generation. So that's an entirely new structure to that system that has a new way that it can survive future events and potentially has very different vulnerabilities than what we currently are experiencing. And so our perfectly robust systems, our rebounding systems are good, but not the only solution. We need systems that can create new capacities when they're needed. And we need systems that can adapt and completely change their structure and function when we realize that the structure and function they currently have is not serving the purposes that we want them to. So to try and put all of these concepts and these ideas about what we want to see resilient systems do, we want the robustness, the rebound, the extensibility, the adaptability. We try and take a step back to really understand what the system is and how it works first. And so to really improve, let's say, the ability to extend operations, we have to know what our operations can handle in the first place. And so one of the places that Dave and I like to start our analysis and the way that we like to think about resilience is starting with kind of this view that all systems are limited. They have some operational boundary in what they can handle. And that depends on things like the people, the physical structures, the equipment in the system, as well as the interactions across these social, environmental, and technological systems in the Virgin Islands that Dave presented earlier. And so we can think about operational boundary in a very, very technical way. This is a kind of a, not really a cartoon sketch, this is a pretty accurate depiction of the water distribution system across the Virgin Islands. So we have a system that connects St. Thomas and St. John in the north through undersea pipelines, as well as a system on St. Croix. The water is produced in the west in St. Thomas and goes to the east to St. John, and in St. Croix it's produced in the east in Christiansted and goes west to Frederiksted. And in both of these systems, there's limited capacity to be providing water. So for example, there's tanks in Sarah Hill and St. Thomas. These are very, very large water tanks that hold all the water before it really enters the water distribution system. So anyone who's hooked up to the WAPA water pipeline, the total capacity for that pipeline to deliver water is dictated by how much water these tanks can hold. So that's like an operational boundary on what is even possible in terms of water. Equivalently, but slightly differently in St. Croix, there's major tanks in Christiansted for storing water that enter the water system, but there's this tank in the center of the island for Kings Hill that is entirely gravity fed towards Frederiksted. So how much water is inside this Kings Hill tank determines really how much water the communities downstream in Frederiksted will be receiving. And so each of these parts of the system have some physical structural capacity, some volume that you could calculate that tells you just how much water we could be moving in these systems, how much water can we possibly have. And knowing this operational boundary helps us understand what stresses the system might experience. And what we find is systems like the water distribution system, the power system, the telecommunications system, the transportation systems that we study, they also have all these common patterns that the capacity, the amount of water that they can hold, the amount of water that they can pump, the ability breaks down in a way that reduces our ability to adapt, reduces our ability to extend the operations, reduces our robustness, reduces our ability to rebound. So some common patterns that we find across various systems. So this is in the literature, largely driven by a colleague of ours, David Woods at Ohio State University. He's been studying systems like space systems, healthcare, all over different critical infrastructure, and he's found these different ways that they break down. First off, is the system exhausts its capacity to adapt to disturbances as challenges cascade. We like to call this decompensation. And we see this just immediately after the storm. So our water distribution system has a lot of water in these tanks, but if you don't have pumping, you can't move water from the tanks necessarily to the rest of the communities. And so at a certain point, once the pumps are out and the power's down, you have a limited amount of water that you could be distributing to the communities. And your system will reach its threshold to adapt. And with multiple Category 5 storms back to back, you're just going to decompensate and reach these critical thresholds. Another way that systems tend to break down that make it so they don't adapt effectively, we aren't necessarily resilient, is when individual actors, so this could be WAPA, this could be other folks using the water system, do what we call working across purposes. So we're accessing water in a way that doesn't necessarily help the whole community respond, adapt, recover, all those nice things we like to see. And so one example that we like to use immediately after the storms, Carnival Cruise brought in a cruise ship as a place to have all the line crews and folks who were recovering the power transportation systems. It was parked in Frederiksted. And although they were recovering the infrastructure, one of the issues was it had such a strong water draw on the water distribution system in Frederiksted, it would start blanking the pipes and lead to other folks not being able to access water even when the water distribution system was back up and running. And so we have folks there to recover the systems, but because of the way that we set up our response, we actually work across purposes and make it so our water distribution system doesn't effectively provide the services that it could. So we reach our capacity of our systems and we decompensate and we just lose the function entirely. We have the function, but we utilize it in weird ways that make it so that we're working across purposes. And then the last example of common ways that our systems fail to adapt is we get stuck in outdated behaviors. And so this is, rather than updating the way that we understand our system, updating our understanding of our infrastructure, we just use the old understanding, the pre-storm understanding, for example, that leads us to bad responses. So one example might be in March of 2019, there were major pump failures across the WAPA water distribution system. To try and adapt to it, they installed brand new pumps very quickly. The problem was these brand new pumps had different sizing of pipes and had different pressures than what they were used to before. And they ended up blanking pipes and causing some downstream outages, even though they had more strong pressure that they could be providing. And so utilizing the pumps in the old ways didn't work. And they had to spend a couple of weeks trying to adapt their operations before they could really utilize these brand new pumps to try and get water back to Frederiksted. So getting stuck in outdated behaviors that don't match our new operational environment make it so even if we have a system that could work, we can't necessarily utilize it effectively. And we adapt potentially in a brittle way. I'll pause there because I think someone raised a hand.
Yeah, Dan, there was a question, I think from Megan had a question. And just while she's maybe unmuting her mic, just want to say we do not intend to be picking on WAPA Water here. Actually, we work very closely with them. And so shout out to Brian Leonard and Don Gregoire, who are in charge of keeping that whole thing running.
Yeah, so WAPA Water is wonderful. And the examples we have are not trying to say that they're doing a bad job. It's just, we could be, there's been issues across all the lifeline infrastructure systems. We just had some very specific ones that we'd like to highlight here. These are just to try and emphasize what decompensation, working across purposes and getting stuck in outdated behaviors might look like. And this happens to all of our systems, especially in the Virgin Islands. We have to try and think about these things for power, water, transportation, and otherwise. So there was a hand raised.
Yep, this is Megan. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
So this question may be getting ahead of things a little bit, but I may have to drop off for a little while. So I wanted to make sure I asked it. It seems like organic ongoing learning process is like pretty critical. Like it's the core essentially of like what a resilient system would be. And the awareness of and receptivity to change really seems like a major driver here. How can we, as a sector, sort of inspire that kind of thinking, because I'm just using the last 2 years in this pandemic as an example. I feel like there's generally a real resistance to recognizing that like you can feel really ready for something and like think you know everything about how something works, and then you might learn something new and it might change. It just seems like that's something that humanity as a whole is really struggling with grasping.
Yeah, Megan, that's a great question. So a couple quick responses. Number one, this is being recorded. So if you have to drop off, hopefully you'll get the next, you can come back and watch it later. Number two, what's immediately going to follow is going to start to talk about the processes that are involved in how you can, the processes that will help to make you more resilient, to make you more extensible, to make you more adaptable. And so that's explicitly what Dan's going to go into next. But you're absolutely right that, one of the issues when you deal with surprise has to do with all kinds of cognitive biases that essentially, as humans, we tend to discount signals that would tell us that things are not as they should be, or we don't understand things as well as we are. The world is not the way that we already think it is. There's a lot of prior work out there that shows that this is a really common problem. And one of the ways that, systems become brittle is that those kind of in charge of running the system, maybe there are warning signs, but you say, oh, that's an outlier. Oh, I don't need to pay attention to that. Oh, that's not important. Right. And then the after action report says, oh my gosh, right, it was right there. Why didn't anybody pay attention to it? And so being able to break through that is a real challenge, is a real concern. And it means that we have to be actively monitoring and thinking about this. But this is also very much an active area of research right now in terms of how you become better prepared for surprise. And it's one of the things that Dan and I are working on. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And I just wanted to say that, so we like to focus on processes, which I'll get to in a minute again, but a false sense of comfort or bravado, let's say thinking that we can handle things that we can't, might put you in a more dangerous position than being a little more reserved and say that maybe we should, wait to see what happens. So a lot of this pushback on robustness that you're hearing us make comes from the standpoint that in our world of engineering and infrastructure, we tend to have a lot of folks who make systems that are highly reliable on paper and really robust on paper, but in practice end up failing. And thinking that system will never fail ends up being one of the main issues that causes greater catastrophe than if we were to just be a little more reserved in our belief that it's going to survive the next disaster. Okay, so jumping back in, right? We have these different ways that our systems become brittle, but we also have ways that we could try and be resilient and adapt. And in the Virgin Islands, we have a lot of capacity, especially in water, as a good example, to try and stretch our capability in ways that are otherwise not seen elsewhere in the United States. So one great example would be our cisterns and our households, our water trucks. Not everyone requires access to the water distribution pipeline. Most buildings have some form of water storage and or rainwater catchment. We can ration water in different ways that are otherwise unavailable to other locations. Neighbors or other folks can share water that they otherwise wouldn't be able to in other places. And we have water trucks and other modes of moving water and getting water to communities that we otherwise don't have available in other places. So these options might not necessarily seem as things that we would want to implement as part of our resilience plan. And maybe we've never really used the water trucks as a disaster response option, but they're sitting there as potentially some way for us to improvise and adapt in new ways. And so simply making the best pipeline or the strongest pump is important, but it's not going to be the only solution to making sure that we have enough adaptive capacity and ability to extend in different ways to ensure that water, the service of water, is being provided to the communities given the potential for these disruptions. And so to really pin down on what Megan was asking, how do we identify and utilize these different capacities that are available to us, both, let's say, in our built infrastructure, in our water distribution system, and in our other systems like our water trucks and cisterns. We like to focus on adaptive processes and in the actual things that are going on in our head, that are going on in our systems, that allow us to improvise. And so there are 4 key things that you can do, or a system can do, an organization can do, that if you're doing them well and trying to improve them, allow us to better adapt to future disasters or events that we couldn't necessarily think of prior. And this follows kind of a simple process of sensing, anticipating, adapting, and learning. These are processes that we are all doing all the time. These verbs are verbs that come from a lot of different literature simultaneously. There's psychological literature behind this. There's literature about habits. These verbs, sensing, anticipating, adapting, and learning, I'll refer to as SAL several times, come from the resilient systems community. But if you think about it, we observe, we orient, we think about what we're going to do, we adapt to situations, and we learn from past events. And if we can do these things better, if we could put processes, practices, infrastructure in place to do these things better, we anticipate better adaptation to future events and being able to extend our operations more effectively and adapt our operations more effectively. Dave, yes. I see your face. Is there another question? I'm not monitoring the chat all that well. All right, I'm just gonna move on. So how do we define these verbs? So sensing, we call it, it's a process to apprehend and interpret information about a system's operational states. So really the way in which we collect data, the way in which we are identifying what's going on as the disaster occurs, before it occurs, as our systems are operating every single day. Anticipating is taking in information and being able to think about what the future might hold, right? So it's describing, involving, imagining, planning, preparing. What are we doing? What are our models in our head? What are our literal models for our systems that are telling us, you know, if the hurricane comes, this is what's going to fail on your power grid. This is how your pipes might break. These are the roads that are going to flood. If you hear that a hurricane's coming, what are you anticipating in terms of, do I need to buy sandbags? What do I need to purchase in case the stores are unavailable? What do I need in my home? The way in which we anticipate, the processes we anticipate, affect how resilient we will be. Adapting is like the actions we actually take. So if we anticipate that we need to buy sandbags, we're going to drive to the place that has the sandbags and get them. And so being able to drive there, being able to access the sandbags, that's a form of adaptation. Now that you've sensed that there's an event that's coming, anticipating what needs to be done, you go and do it. And then learning is essentially integrating all of these different options and decisions that we've made into our future responses. And so how we collected that information about the hurricane that's coming, how we anticipated what we could do about it, how we accessed those resources or took those actions, reflecting on that and being able to update the ways that we do all of those things is what learning is about. And as I think Megan emphasized, you know, being able to sense, anticipate, adapt, and learn, and doing this faster and better, we anticipate personally, it will make the systems in the Virgin Islands far more resilient. And so the question that we like to leave with people with is, you know, how well do you think your organization do these things? You know, could you make them better? And then one thing we want to emphasize is you need to practice them in order for them to be effective. So an example of sensing might be geospatial data for all of our infrastructure systems across the territory is maybe in a bunch of different hands and not necessarily centralized and varying qualities. And we might know a lot about the water distribution system, but not so much about the sewer system. How can we improve our sensing of our infrastructure? And how can we share information more effectively so when a disaster happens, we can act more effectively? And then we need to practice like actually sharing and actually responding. Otherwise, we might not be able to use these new sensing policies and practices that we put into place. Every organization, every individual does all of these things all the time. Thinking about how your organization is doing these things for the next big disaster and how well you're practicing them is very important.
Yeah, Dan, so just a couple quick augmenting comments here. So as Dan notes, you know, these processes are things that you can exercise in your household right? In your business, in your workplace, at your school, right? These are the processes that create that ability to improvise, create that ability to adapt and extend when things happen that are unanticipated, when things happen that are surprised. And so key questions that you have to ask are, and sensing, what are the things that I should be paying attention to, right? In response to Megan's question before, what happens a lot of times is that people might be sensing things and then discounting them, right? So signals are coming in, but I say, oh, I don't believe it. I'm going to ignore it, right? I've got some kind of bias against it. So part of the active is the active action is making sure that you're being deliberate and that you're being consistent and you're being in those sensing processes. Anticipating follows, right? Okay, if this happens, what am I going to do next, right? And then what am I going to do on the fly? And then the key thing is that this actually has to be practiced, right? It's not enough to just talk about what a fire evacuation plan is for a building. You actually have to have a fire drill, right? Now and again, to kind of see what's going to work and what doesn't work, right? So actively practicing is a key element of all of this. Thanks.
Yeah.
Quick question, two quick questions.
Yes, Greg.
The first one is the fire drills. How do you do it in a way that it doesn't become a drill? And you follow the route, oh, everybody, meets outside under the tree. Okay, that was the drill. And then the second question is, in this loop that you have, there is a need to accept error, or there is a need to, or I feel a need to accept non-perfection. So how do you balance the need to accept non-perfection with saving lives?
So, okay, so a couple reactions. I'm sure Dan will have them too. On your second point, I think a key element of this process is you have to go in recognizing that you don't know everything about your system, right? That the system is not perfect, right? And so you have to have a mindset where you are constantly trying to really ultimately learn about your system and how it works, right? So the idea of perfection is a fiction, and it's a fiction that's not productive, right? So we have to have a mindset of trying things. The very notion of surprise means that we don't know everything, right? We have to have some humility about this. We're not going to be able to anticipate everything. We will be surprised. But when that happens, what are we going to do, right? So that's the second question. Can you remind me of just the first question, because I hadn't answered that one too.
The first question is, when is a fire drill just a drill rather than something helpful?
Well, so this is actually a big challenge for critical infrastructures writ large, right? So what's the equivalent of the power, of the fire drill for the electric power grid, right? So typically these lifeline infrastructures are ones where we do not want to take them out of service for fear that it leads to other kinds of things. Having said that, there are scheduled maintenance outages that do happen. And those can and ought to be used to exercise other kinds of things, right? So on some level, right? So let's take the electric power as an example, right? Perhaps that there's a city block or something that needs to have a certain, transformer change or something, so power is going to be out for a certain amount of time. Those kind of maintenance outages, right, could be coordinated with other agencies, emergency responders and whatnot for that local community to be able to practice what happens when the power goes out for a period of time. This is an opportunity for you to try, test your generator, make sure that it's working, do other kinds of things, right? So it's the coordination of these kinds of things that has the potential for new kinds of learning. And the whole idea of this practice is that you learn through the experience of actually, exercise in this way.
Yeah, so
Kim's got a question.
Well, I want to augment that. A very concrete example. So we work in the military, and very recently they've started what are called energy resilience readiness exercises, but are more commonly referred to as pull the plug exercises. We have a lot of backup generators on a military installation, and folks will show up and pull the plug and turn off electricity to the installation to make sure that all of that backup generation is working. Often in the way that we like to engineer our systems, the way that we like to think about, we don't want the potential for a blackout to really happen. We don't want to deal with the potential aftermath of that. Maybe we'll test the backup generator. Maybe we'll just make sure it kicks on. Maybe we'll make sure that it works when we install it, but we won't ever use it in a real blackout until a real blackout occurs. What we've identified, at least in certain cases, in very particular communities, which are very critical, and we have issues, right? We don't want bad things to happen, is that we can't trust that anymore. We have to shut down the power to make sure that their backup generators work. So it's not like the way to get from a drill to like reality, the closer you can get to the real situation where you experience the actual use of the infrastructure, the system, or the practice that you put in place, the better. And we have the opportunity, as Dave said, just in normal operations of our systems to try and test those things. Often we're not utilizing those opportunities.
Kim, question.
Yeah, no, it's really good to hear you guys discuss this. I mean, one of the things about this sensing, anticipating, adapting, and learning, it requires a level of knowledge and familiarity by the key players. I mean, it's a really strong knowledge base at that sort of systems level. And I guess one of the things that we're seeing in our analysis for the hazard mitigation and resilience planning effort is that, you know, there are a number of agencies or sectors in the territory where, you know, people and or systems are siloed extensively. I mean, they really don't know what's going on either immediately around them or more broadly, you know, between agencies that actually need to cooperate or collaborate either pre and post disaster. And so, you know, I'm trying to, you know, while this is really ideal, both idealistic and ideal in the sense that it makes a lot of sense, I'm trying to figure out how we can take the current reality and shape it to some degree to integrate some of this, recognizing that there will still be lots of people that don't necessarily know what's going on. And so I don't know if you can speak to that. That may be a long separate topic.
Yeah, so just responding to that quickly, right? So going back to an earlier point, I mean, I think one of the things that comes through in this figure is that this can't just be done by emergency managers, right? You have to have the actual infrastructure system operators involved in this, right? They're the ones with the expertise, right? So this kind of perspective has to be done in partnership with all the different members of this living system, right? Exactly to your point. So how do we go about breaking down those barriers? I mean, I think that in general that's challenging, but to the extent that you actually start to do some of these exercises, what you will quickly learn is who knows and doesn't know what, right? I mean, there's nothing like a fire, you know, an actual fire drill to figure out that different people in different parts of the building haven't talked to each other, right? So to some extent, these exercises or the plans for these exercises or the threat of actually doing these exercises gets folks to the table. Going back to Dan's example of these pull the plug exercises, before they actually pull the plug, they actually do get people together to kind of talk about it. It's not a complete surprise. And in fact, it's those conversations coming together that tend to be really revealing, right? You have people from different part of a military installation talking to each other and saying, oh, I never realized that, you know, you depended on this, or I depended on that, or this is how it worked, right? And so to some extent, part of the goal is the learning that comes out of that.
Right. So, I mean, a concrete example from work that we did in the Virgin Islands is we were studying, you know, even with hurricane hardening, what's the likelihood of a blackout, right? Like, even if the poles survive, will people lose power? And often that's the case is, yes, you will have blackouts for category 3, 4, 5 hurricanes. You'll be able to recover faster because a lot of those poles are still there, but you're going to still lose power. And communicating that from the power side to the water side was critical, because the water people are just hearing, we have composite power poles, we're hardened, versus, oh, we might actually lose power for a Category 4 storm, even though this thing's rated for Category 5 that's right next to us, because other cables might get ripped out that might not necessarily survive. Being able to have that kind of conversation changes the calculus for how they plan to coordinate, rather than being surprised when the event actually occurs. And so the conversation before the event is really, really critical. I think going back to what makes systems fail to adapt, we don't necessarily need some like omniscient central control that everybody knows everything and is like telling everybody what to do. But what we want to avoid are two things. One that we call decompensation, which is like we breach the capacity for people to do what they want to do. And often in practice, when it comes to the folks on the ground, we hear them say, that's not my job, right? It's not my job. I am breached my threshold on what I can handle, and I'm not going to do that additional work for you, right? That's outside of my requirements. And so being in an exercise allows you to identify kind of where the real thresholds are and what people are willing to and capable of doing. Second thing is we want to avoid working across purposes. So even if things are siloed, they might be actually really well coordinated, even though they're not talking to each other. We can have highly distributed systems that kind of figure themselves out, right? Living systems do that very often. They don't really know how they're coordinating, but they are. On the other hand, if they're directly making each other's lives more difficult, making that clear to folks and saying, you're making it like you could be more than the sum of your parts if you just changed your internal practices, because it's really making that guy's job very difficult in this other organization, or vice versa, that can be a game changer in terms of adaptive capacity down the line. There's a lot more hands raised.
Yeah, Ilya's got one.
That's useful, thank you. Ilya.
Hey, everybody. I just had a question. Dave and Dan, great presentation. Could you talk about the idea of surprise and potential for emerging new systems, given that we are talking about relying on systems that we recognize, but how do we see the potential in recognizing new emerging systems in surprise situations, and how do the Virgin Islands and other places potentially take advantage of that, foster that, and advance that?
So I think that's a good question. It's a pretty broad question, right? So I'll try to be maybe a little bit more specific. I mean, I think that what we're talking about here is creating the ability to improvise, right? And improvisation leads to a lot of these emergent behaviors, right? And so, so I guess one of the things is that, in general, right, a lot of the extensibility, a lot of the adaptive capacity, a lot of the ability to improvise resides in the humans involved in these systems, right? I mean, the physical systems, the pipes, the wires, the whatnot, maybe they have some ability to flex, but where this really happens, it's in the humans that are doing this. And so, so there are best practices for, teaching people how to improvise, how to collaborate, how to do these kinds of things. And, the first step is sort of knowing who to call, right? So a lot of the first step for a lot of this is like, okay, who are the people in these other organizations that I might potentially need to call, right? That's good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that when the time comes, the people involved are going to be able to figure it out. It's much better to have actually had some interaction, for them to actually have rehearsed, for them to have interacted in some way. And so I think that it's in those interactions, in those engagements, that some of these new ideas come up, right? And oftentimes it's not until you find yourself in the moment that you say, hey, could we do this? I don't know, we've never tried it that way, but yeah, it looks like it's feasible. Let's give it a try, right? So I don't know, that's only a partial answer, but I think it's worth more.
I'll also augment. So we don't have it in this slide deck, but we actually, there are, like, as Dave mentioned earlier, there is kind of a theory to different kinds of surprises. We have different ways we think about surprises. And there's, as you're suggesting, There's what we call situational surprises, which is we understand our system, and in this event just is kind of a rare, catastrophic big one that maybe we could have anticipated exactly. But there's this other kind where you have a fundamental surprise, where you have a new thing that you don't really know what to anticipate, and it goes beyond maybe any of your expectations. And I really appreciate your comment, because it's more of a positivist view of it than what we would normally say, right? You're saying there's new practices and systems that are being put in place that if we could just identify them and harness them, we'd be more resilient. The point of saying sensing, anticipating, adapting, and learning are important is not to say you should identify the stock variable that you need to be measuring and measure it, right? It's to improve your flexibility to sense, to identify new things as they're coming up. And so what we hope is, rather than we say this is what critical function is and now we're sensing the right variable and we're just watching it change over time and marking it, when we say improve sensing, we're saying trying to find ways to broaden and expand the kinds of information that you would be considering and that you're able to handle when trying to make decisions for dealing with disasters. And so improving sensing, for example, hopefully will expand the things that you're looking at to identify these new systems or these new processes that you might be able to harness. Equivalently, improving anticipating, adapting, and learning, or any of these processes, the goal of improving these processes and changing them is to make them flexible to handle the new systems or changes that we otherwise would go unnoticed, right? What we tend to do is we put our heads down, we focus on our stock variable, maybe it's the amount of electricity we're generating, maybe it's the amount of water we're delivering, or whatever our systems are saying and how they operate, rather than trying to expand our ability to sense and anticipate to include new forms of energy or energy efficiency, like less energy use, new production, new access, right? We tend to think of systems narrowly. We want to try to expand that. So hopefully, by improving SOL and recommendations to improve SOL, you get better at sensing new systems as they appear.
And I think just augmenting that briefly, and then Mario will go to your question. What it means is that we want to encourage people who say, this looks funny, or this doesn't look right, or I don't know, I don't understand what's going on here. We want to encourage that, as opposed to saying, oh, that's not what we pay attention to. We just focus on this one thing. That's not what we care about. That's right. We want to, like, the things that look weird, the things that look odd, like we want to encourage that kind of exploration and encourage that kind of conversation. That is encouraging sensing, as opposed to kind of shutting it down. That's a good question.
Just quickly, and Mario, we're going to get to your question. I just want to do a quick time check. We have 7 minutes before the end. Mario.
Yeah, I think we've only got one more point to make, one more slide to make, other than a summary. So Mario, let's go to your question, and then I think we'll still finish on time. And I could stay longer too if other folks want to have questions afterwards.
Thank you. In regards to the 4 key processes, in my sort of experience around the country, when I look at, say, the Midwest North, like UND up in North Dakota, for instance, my son went to school there, and there's a lot of snow, but the schools have tunnels that allow the kids to maneuver to get from classes to class. And in California, for instance, you've got a lot of earthquakes. And so in addition to learning about how to protect yourself against earthquake, what they've done is they've turned to retrofitting. In the Midwest, they go to basements and cellars and so forth to protect folks. And here in the VI, we have cisterns. Then we go to potable water when the cistern gets contaminated. The question is, moving forward, do we use that information to plan ahead? Like, for instance, here we may need, say, safe rooms to protect against hurricanes and to protect against, say, earthquakes. Is that something that's considered beyond these 4 key processes?
So my short answer is, I think yes. And I think, at least based on the conversations I've been having with Greg and Kim and the HMRP team, that's very much the kind of things that they're trying to be forward-looking, to think about potential threats, hazards, things exacerbated by climate change, sea level rise, all these kinds of things. That's exactly part of the discussion and the planning process that's going into this hazard mitigation and resilience planning effort.
And I just, you know, if we could go back in time and ask the folks who are really coming up with the ideas of having both a water pipeline and cisterns and water trucks and how we integrated it, right? If we were following that and managing it and kind of watching its natural growth, the thinking that went into, oh, we identify that need and now people have these extensible capacities that are otherwise unavailable in other parts of the world. If we could apply that same process to all of our infrastructure, then all of our infrastructure would be more resilient because of it. So what we tend to see is in particular key areas, folks are really good at dealing with like the hazard that's in their mind, right? In Arizona, where I lived, everyone's really good at drought management. And so they have tons of underwater storage, earthquakes in California, major freezes in North Dakota, potential access to water in the Virgin Islands. If we could apply that same thinking and practices to all of our systems rather than just the one that seems to be, you know, the loudest one or the one that we have to deal with right now, then we'd have more resilience in general.
Yeah. Dan, let's go to the next slide. We're almost out of time.
All
right. So okay. So going kind of maybe back to the beginning a little bit, as well as to some of the great comments that have been posted in the chat. You know, so if we all agree that resilience is the thing that we want, why don't we have it? Well, there are at least 4 barriers, practical barriers to actually making this happen. The first one is, well, we don't recognize how poorly we're prepared. I don't think that's the case in the VI, given all of the extreme weather events and other things. You all are actively working on this kind of thing. So for, you know, step one is you got to recognize you need to do it. Number 2 is we don't know how to create resilience, right? And that's a lot of what this conversation is about. How do we go about, what are the processes involved in making ourselves more resilient? How do we practice this? How do we develop that capability? How do we learn to extend, to adapt, to improvise? And then that's very much an ongoing thing. It's not like the book has been written on this. We're still learning and learning together. But there are 2 other points that have been, I think, sort of alluded to in the chat. And that is that even if we know we need resilience, even if we think we have ideas for how to create it, we don't always have the incentives to create it. We might not have the financial support to do it. We may not be willing to pay. We may not, there may be a number of reasons that prevent that incentive. Right? Somebody else is going to take care of it. I don't need to act, right? So incentives, particularly economic incentives, are a big thing, and figuring out how to enable that is a key thing. And you know, there's been a lot of federal support sort of directed at trying to make that easier. But then the last thing is that even if you have the incentives and the financial support to do it, there can be organizational or governance barriers to creating resilience. Right? It could be the way in which things are organized, the way things are managed, the way things are siloed, the way in which folks do or don't talk to each other, that cause those problems of implementation. And I know that there are ongoing conversations that are supportive of that, right? And so the key point is that to actually get there, we have to overcome all of these things. Dan, let's just go to the next slide real quick, and then we'll break for questions. And I apologize for us going right up to the time, right? So, and Megan, I do see your hand up. We'll get to you right at the end of this, right? So summarizing kind of what we talked about here, right? So we think of the Virgin Islands as a living system. It is constantly evolving. It is not static. It is ongoing change, whether that change is directed or not, right? So you shouldn't expect that the future is going to be like the past or even like it is today. We will argue that resilience is more than robustness and rebound, although those are important things, and we want our systems to be robust and we want our systems to rebound. That is not the extent to what resilience is. It's not about what you have, it's about what you do. It's these active processes that are important, and these processes need to be practiced. So to the extent that you can be thinking about the doing and not just the having, that's what we argue for, right? Think of resilience as a verb, not a noun. It's not the having. And again, if you say resiliency, we're going to say yuck. That's our own little pet peeves. But understand where that comes from. Again, invest in resilience processes. right? Sense, anticipate, adapt, and learn. Invest in them, practice them. These are the things that are really important. And there are lots of ways to get involved, right? And so this ongoing effort that Kim and Greg are organized, I think is a great way to do it. We're really excited and proud to be a part of it and hoping that this is helpful. So with that, Dan, maybe go to the last slide, which has our contact information on it. We welcome comments and feedback, and I want to thank you all for your attention. And let me just turn it over to Greg just real quick to see how he wants to manage, now that we're at the end of time, questions and other kinds of things. We are happy to stay on as long as folks want to chat. There's nothing pending, but again, thank you all very much for the opportunity to come and present. And we look forward to being able to come again and visit soon, hopefully this fall.
Thank you so much. And Kim, do you want to close or give some remark? I think we want to put maybe 5 more minutes for question. But Kim, do you want to? So actually, let's do that. Let's do 5 more minutes for question and comments. And then Kim, if you don't mind closing. Does that work?
That sounds fine.
Okay.
Okay, I see Megan's hand up. I don't know if others have their hand up.
This is Megan. My question is sort of related to that last point about what are our barriers to resilience, organizational barriers specifically. Obviously there's great work being done at UVI. There's great work being done all over the country and all over the world at like the sort of graduate, postgraduate level, at the university level. But how much conversation is there about, how are we teaching our children to think in systems? How are we teaching them to think about creating resilience and living sort of an exercise of resilience? Because I really do, we all see that this is like generationally going to become more and more impactful. And I do feel, certainly I run a nonprofit in our sector, as we try to hire young people coming into the field, like there's not always a whole lot of like depth of knowledge in this space. And how can we maybe drive the sort of high school and middle school level to like start talking about this in their programming more?
I think it's a good question. So, I mean, I think that there are both formal and informal ways that this can be taught, right? I mean, to the extent that these are things that you can practice in your own household, right? Or your own community, these are things that can be kind of taught at that level. Dan and I have been involved with Greg and Kim in developing sort of a program at UVI for our undergraduate pre-engineering courses that are intended to be able to, have students think and learn about, the VI as a living system, to learn about these processes, to learn about these kinds of issues. So there are things, at the undergraduate level that we can certainly do, but there's no doubt that in terms of capacity building, there's opportunities to take a lot of the things that we've talked about here and potentially put them into K through 12 types of programs, right? And so, for those on the call who are interested in capacity building, educational program kinds of things, certainly there are opportunities, and we'd be happy to talk to you all about it. So that's at least my answer.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Kim, do you want to close it?
All right, no, thank you, Dave and Dan, for your comments today. I think it builds off of what we've been doing both yesterday and over the course of our planning efforts with our colleagues at Chima, and just to build off of what Dave just talked about with this pre-engineering program at UVI. I think the university has a unique opportunity to start thinking about these new areas. I mean, that require sort of an interdisciplinary training and orientation in the students, but also extend that out to informal learning opportunities, whether it's through, programs like Greg leads with the Caribbean Green Technology Center we're doing in training, or information sharing, webinars, seminars, et cetera, or with BIF score that I'm responsible for. We have a strong informal learning opportunity as well. all of these still need to be brought together. And I think one of the things I'll make a plug for is that we are, Greg and I and other leaders here at the university are putting together a Center for Resilience and Sustainability. And this is the educational piece that I think would be central to that effort to broaden the awareness across different demographics in the workforce, in K-12 and elsewhere, and take advantage of some of the built environment that we have, for example, UBI Cell and so forth, programs that would really cultivate the kind of mindset around system thinking, around resilience, the practice of resilience instead of the object of resilience, in a way that, hopefully is transformative. It's going to be like resilience itself. It takes a long time to sort of get minds wrapped around how to think about this, whether it's around systems or resilience. And it'll take time. We're no different than other jurisdictions, territories, or states, but we have some unique challenges here, our small population size, our remoteness, supply chain issues, on and on and on. But I think we have a real opportunity to make some inroads with some of the ideas that were shared today. So I want to thank, again, our speakers and Greg for organizing this. And if you have any questions, resilientvi.org is a way to reach out to the team here at UVI. And Dan and Dave provided their contact information as well. And reiterating the point that we have this presentation recorded, so it will be available and we'll let you know about it. So thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Stay safe, stay sane, and work on that resilience.